Hello and welcome to Matrix Live. My guest today is Devon, Senior Software Engineer at Element. Devon, welcome. Is it fair to say that you're working primarily on portable identities and notably on Dendrite?
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, that's what I've been working on for the past couple months now. Um, so we're working on getting, hopefully, towards the future where you'll be able to port your account between different home servers. So right now, what that's looking like is working on what's called cryptographic identities, so that you can decouple your matrix ID from the events that they're used in, such as the sender field, etc., so that in the future you can change to have a different matrix ID associated with a different home server and not have everything fall apart and break.
Right, so as you're starting to touch on this topic, portable identities is quite a hairy topic. So you recently opened MSC 4080, which is cryptographic identities. A few weeks ago, I received Keegan, who came to talk about pseudonymous identities. So is cryptographic identity a sort of superseding pseudonymous identity?
Not quite. They're kind of built off of each other. It's a little confusing since they have very similar names, and in essence, they're kind of the same thing under the hood. Pseudonymous identities was our first step towards account portability, which is doing the decoupling of the matrix ID from a user's identity in a room. So what that did was we replaced the usages of the matrix ID with a public key, and this was being generated by the user's home server for simplicity, rather than having to do a whole bunch of client-side changes and try and risk that at the same time as trying to figure out how to make this fundamental change to matrix events. We just had the home servers generate the public and private keys for all users for every room. So that decouples a user from their home server for every given event. So there's no longer any specific information tying a user to a home server other than in one location, because it's needed somewhere to make sure you can still route to that client to know which home server they're associated with. But then cryptographic identities build on top of that. And what it does is it takes those keys and it moves them to the client side. So instead of having the server generate the keys for that represent a user's identity in a room, now the client is generating those keys so that it's the one true owner of the private key, and there's no more issues with when you move to a different home server, the home server having a copy of your private key and you having to trust that it forgot it when you move to a different server. Now the client just owns all its keys, so that there's only one source of truth and there's only one possibility for an event to be signed by that user.
All right, so you're mentioning private keys, the keys being on the end user device. It sounds an awful lot like end-to-end encryption, and end-to-end encryption is quite good. As a Matrix user and more generally as a privacy enthusiast, I quite like end-to-end encryption, but it comes with its own lot of foot guns. Like, for example, if I use end-to-end encryption with a private key on my device and I lose my device, well, I lost access to my data. So end-to-end encryptions, usually with asymmetric cryptography, you have a few ways to prevent depending on a single device. But in our case, with cryptographic identities, if I use the same matrix account both on my phone and laptop, will it work for me? Can I use cryptographic identities if I rely on several clients?
Yeah, that's the goal. In theory, what this will look like is basically the same way that you can share encryption keys right now in Matrix, whether that's directly between devices with two device messages or via server-side key backup mechanics. And there's not really much difference between a key used for encryption and a key used for cryptographic identity. It's effectively the same thing. So we should be able to leverage all the existing infrastructure used for sharing your encryption keys today between devices. We haven't put a lot of effort into exactly specifying that yet for cryptographic identities, because we assume it's not that it's necessarily a solved problem, but there's already mechanisms in place in Matrix that handle that, and we should be able to piggyback off those. And any changes or upgrades to those mechanisms in the future should only also benefit what we're working on. So instead of focusing on that area of cryptographic identities, for now we've focused on the bigger problems with just getting the events to work in the first place. But in theory, yes, it should be able to work just fine on multiple events, similar to encryption does today.
All right, so still in theory because it's early days for that, but if it's using the same mechanisms as the key backup matrix already relies on, if I lose my device in the same way, I'm not losing my whole history, my whole encrypted history. I'm not going to lose my identity in the future with cryptographic identities because of the same backup mechanisms, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you should have the same recovery mechanisms as you do today with encryption keys. If there's one caveat to that, in the case where you actually do lose your ability to recover those keys, if you still have access to your Matrix account for some reason, but you don't have your keys, for end-to-end encryption, that just means you can't read those messages, period, because you can't recover a lost key until, I guess, quantum encryption breaks stuff. But until that future day, you just can't recover it. With cryptographic identities, it's a little different. Right now, the way everything's designed such that we assume there's only one cryptographic identity per user per room. But there's nothing theoretically stopping a user from having multiple cryptographic identities for a room. So in theory, with a user with the same matrix ID could rejoin the existing rooms that they were in just using a different identity key. And it wouldn't be as seamless as recovering your account, but there's nothing theoretically stopping that from functioning such that you're not out entirely from using your account in the future.
All right, makes a lot of sense. So cryptographic identities and portable identities more generally are solving a very difficult problem we have in federated systems, which is picking a server. It's quite difficult to meet the user and say, oh, welcome, pick a server, because they don't even know what the app is about and they can't try it. So Matrix is not exempt to that problem. Matrix.org is a very prominent server in the Federation, the same way Mastodon.social is one of the biggest Fediverse server. With cryptographic identities, if your identity is bound to a key, do you still need a home server at all?
This is a great question. The short answer is yes. People will still need a home server. The much longer version of that is cryptographic identities takes a step forward in that it changes the dynamic such that clients are now in control of signing the events. So this home server is no longer needed in the loop to sign events on a client's behalf. But a big thing stopping clients from not needing a home server altogether is they still need to perform state resolution and get the state of the DAG and receive events and be able to calculate what the previous events and auth events for a new event should be when they create a new event. Nothing prevents the client from doing that today, other than I don't think there's a client in existence that does its own state resolution. So that would be a thing. And then there's another problem where you need to be able to route events to that client. In today's matrix, this is done by taking the domain portion of a matrix ID and using that to say, hey, route this event to this home server, this endpoint effectively, and deliver that onto the client. Whereas if the client was operating without a home server, it would, in the way networking works today, there's typically, if you're using something like a phone to use matrix, you don't really have a routable device generally on the internet. So being able to route to that device is a fundamental necessity in order to have matrix work. But then you start getting awfully close to what peer-to-peer matrix is trying to solve. And that's a different discussion.
Right, that was going to be my follow-up question. P2P matrix has been, I wouldn't say announced, but has been worked on for a long time. And cryptographic identities is working to a sort of adjacent problem, but is not exactly solving the same problems as P2P matrix. But it's solving a very, very important topic, which is, well, the ability to port your data here and there across home servers. With that said, I'm wondering, can I port all of my data from one home server to another? And to be more precise, when there is a change in how data is structured in a room, or when there is a new feature that is introduced that is not backward compatible, like knocking, for example, usually there is a new room version. So does cryptographic identity rely on a new room version?
Yeah, it'll rely on a new room version because of the way that auth rules have to change, etc. primarily, but just in general, it kind of fundamentally shakes up how events are structured. So we'll need a new room version for that. But then also alongside that, we kind of need a bunch of new endpoint versions as well for clients to talk to, since the normal way of sending events to a server involves you calling an endpoint like send or invite or something like that, and then having your home server kind of populate and create the event on your behalf. Maybe the client provides a bit of the content, but for the most part, the home server creates the event and adds it to the room and sends it off to whoever else is in the room. With this new approach, we're going down the path of changing that up a bit to then have the home server populate the event on a client's behalf, but then instead of taking it and then sending it off to the room immediately, it has to send it back to the client for the client to sign and finalize before the client then passes it on to the home server to be propagated throughout the room and all the different home servers. So all the endpoints where you would normally have events being created and added to rooms have been updated to be changed to pass back this PDU to be signed and finalized by the client. There's other approaches that we've looked at as well, where you could have a client, say, delegate to a server to sign events on their behalf, and you can have mechanisms in place to kind of make that work to avoid the round trip. But then you start getting into problems where, say, if you move home servers and you've delegated to the old home server to sign events on your behalf, it becomes very hard to revoke that delegation, to say, hey, that home server is no longer my home server and they can't sign events on my behalf. Only this new home server can. And that especially becomes a problem if you have malicious home servers, because they can effectively replay events on a client's behalf. So if you moved to a new home server, your old home server still had a previous delegated authority to sign on your behalf. If you had sent something like a power level change into the room in the past, that server could take that event, change around the previous events and auth events and such that they replay it into a different part in the DAG and then wreak havoc on the room. So there's a chain of issues with going down that route. So for the simplest approach, we just went for the round trip where a server actually sends a full event back to the client sends it, and then resends it to the home server, since it removes a lot of the issues there.
Right. I don't know if you saw me coming when asking the question about the room version. I'm taking the end user perspective. The whole point of portable identities is to be able to move your account from one home server to another and not lose data. The way matrix rooms version work is basically when you are upgrading from a current stable, I believe it's version 9, room version 9. When you are upgrading the room, what you are actually doing is you are tombstoning the room. So you are sort of putting the room in read-only mode, creating a new room that has the new room version. And the question here is, as an end user who wants to move away from matrix.org to my own home server, for example, will I lose all the content that was in all the room versions that were not cryptographic identities compatible?
Yeah, so that becomes a bit of a tricky question. We're not exactly sure yet. We've kind of left off working on fully fleshing out the upgrade path to this because of the slew of other problems that we've had to deal with so far. For part of that answer is you will only be able to port rooms that have been upgraded to support cryptographic identities in the first place. Whether that means you keep the old history or not is still to be determined in how the upgrade path works. But for sure, it won't work to port a room that hasn't been upgraded, because there's everything's still coupled to the matrix ID, and you can't just change that with old room versions and have them not break. But we still have to look at and figure out if there is a way to update things such that you don't lose entire history, but that will probably be very challenging without just literally updating every event ever sent to the room. But at the very least, we're trying to make sure that you can upgrade a room, and then any rooms that have been upgraded from that point on, at the very least, should be portable to the new home server and continue working. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much point in having a portable identity. But yeah, we still have to dig deeper into the full upgrade path to see how much of that data we can transfer over.
Right, portable identities are a very hairy topic, and it can seem simple at first sight, but there are so many topics when you try to unravel the thing. So we have been mentioning cryptographic identities that you are working on that are building on top of pseudonymous identities that Keegan has been working on. Once you are finished implementing pseudonymous and cryptographic identities, once the MSC is merged in the spec, once everything is stable, will we have portable identities, or do we have more work to do?
So we'll almost be there. The good news is that once all the identity work has been completed, making identities portable is a much simpler task, I guess, at least relatively. Although, in theory, all that needs to be done after that point is take the keys that you already have and move somewhere else. Since that's the only thing stopping you from making new events, other than being routable and doing the room bag stuff, which a server needs to do, you just take your keys, go somewhere else, and then you should be able to start creating new events as if you were still in the room. It gets a little more complicated because to make the routability stuff work, we need new APIs to be able to communicate between home servers that, hey, I want to move my identity over to this new home server, and you need a way to tell the other users in a room that any new events should be sent over here, and then there might need to be some kind of mechanism in place for a grace period, say, for old events coming in to your old home server to be forwarded onto your new one, or there's kind of a bunch of logistical issues and flows around that need to be solved. But none of them are fundamental to the way matrix room events work, like the identity stuff is. So it should be much simpler and shouldn't take quite as long, but there's still a bit of stuff that needs to be layered on top of this work before we get properly portable identities. But once the identity stuff is there, we're much closer, and it shouldn't be as hard to get the rest of the way.
All right, thank you very much for all those detailed answers. Is there something we forgot to mention in the episode? Do you want to add something about portable identities or not?
That pretty much covers most of it. Feel free to take a look through the MSC. That's MSC 4080 if you want to dive into some of the finer details. But this covered most of it, and we'll be just continue to work through the edge cases as we go and hopefully continue to solve problems.
Can I ask you the obvious questions that everybody wants to ask? When?
So right now we have what I call an MVP, but it's more like a hacked together test bed that works for a lot of the basic simple use cases. Things are very much unstable and not usable by any other user other than someone willing to take all the desperate pieces and build them themselves. But we're aiming to have a more usable MVP by around FOSDEM, hopefully. Fingers crossed. So look out for that.
All right, so very good transition because we have both a booth at FOSDEM and a dev room at FOSDEM. So we have a call for papers on the matrix.org website. If you go to matrix.org and to the blog, you will find the call for papers. If you have an interesting topic you want to talk about that is related to Matrix. I hope we are going to get a lot of propositions. I'm sure it's going to be a very successful dev room like we had last year. We're also going to have a booth and we are going to have some merch to sell here. So if you want to support Matrix, you can come. So I'm going to leave a link in the description if you want to support the work. I'm going to leave a link to the office of the Matrix.org Foundation room as well if you want to come to talk to us about what we are doing, what we plan to do, etc. In the meantime, thank you very much, Devon. It was very interesting, Matrix Live, and I will see you next week, Matrix Live.